we have undergone a system or a process, John Ralston Saul calls it a coup d'etat in slow motion, where we have reconfigured power into what he calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. You have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, American patriotism, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. And unfettered, unregulated capitalism, as Karl Marx understood, is a revolutionary force. It commodifies everything. The human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. And in theological terms, these absolute forces that control our lives, not only our lives, but the lives now of most of the people across the planet, are forces of death. They assault, attack, and destroy all the systems that sustain life, and there is nothing within them or nothing now outside of them that will stop this assault. You have seen this writ large across the American landscape as we are reconfigured into a frightening neo-feudalism, a world of masters and serfs. We have seen corporate forces build systems of both legal and physical control that can only be described as totalitarian. Militarized police forces, tanks on the streets of Ferguson against unarmed demonstrators. And once again, you watch people march through the streets, Baltimore, Ferguson, New York, Philadelphia, and they keep killing. We, as citizens, have, many of us in this room, have watched video of one of our fellow citizens who did not commit a crime being choked to death by police on the streets of New York City, and those police walking away. And what has happened with the evisceration of the legal system, with the turning of the courts into a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state, has been accompanied by the rise of what Hannah Arendt called omnipotent policing. She said that when a society creates a mechanism by which a certain segment of that society is stripped of their rights, the way we have with people of color in marginal communities through drug laws, and through a court system where 94% of people are forced to plea out, and they stack you with so many charges, most of which they know are bogus, so the prosecutor can play a kind of card game with you. And if you actually go into the system and go to court, I speak as experience from my students in the prison, they're going to make sure you get the maximum as a kind of message to everyone else. So I have a student from Elizabeth, New Jersey, who had been on the U.S. Army boxing team. They offered him a 16-month plea deal. He said, I didn't do the crime. They gave him 30 years when he went to trial. I have a kid, not a kid anymore, but he was a kid when he was arrested in Camden. It was for a knifing. I'm 100% certain he didn't commit it. He was held in that police station over in Camden all night. 14 years old, he was crying, he was scared, he wanted to go home. They wouldn't let any of his relatives in to see him until he signed a paper, which was a confession. And then he could go home. He spent 2 years, from the age of 14 to 16, on the top floor of the Camden County Jail, which is where the felons are. He goes to trial at 16. He is not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. I could spend the whole night telling you stories like this. So it's important on all of us to look at what's happening to the most vulnerable among us, those who have the least defenses, the least protection, because this is the model system that the corporate state seeks to impose on the wider society. All of this is, as Arendt points out, when you allow this to happen to a certain segment of a society which is demonized, then the moment that there is widespread unrest, it's the flick of a switch, and you can use it on the rest of society. And this reality, this very unpleasant reality, this understanding that there is no way now to appeal to the system to become rational, this understanding that the system has created legal and physical mechanisms to shut us down should we begin to resist, presents to us, I think, a moral quandary. And that is, how will we resist these forces if all of the mechanisms of a functioning capitalist democracy are closed off to us? And I think in that sense, for me, we have to look at rebellion standing up to these very frightening monolithic forces as a kind of moral imperative. And understanding that we can't allow our resistance to be defined by whether or not we succeed. In moments such as these, moments that I think Immanuel Kant and Hannah Arendt would call one of radical evil, the characteristics of a liberal are useless. And Reinhold Niebuhr writes this, saying that in moments of extremity, liberals are too intellectual, too ineffectual, and too little emotional a force to deal with radical evil. That those who rise up and resist are possessed by what he calls sublime madness. And I speak to many figures in the book who are possessed by this sublime madness, who have resisted against overwhelming odds, including Mumia Abu-Jamal, Julian Assange, Jeremy Hammond, the hacker who broke into Stratfor and released 5 million emails, Lynn Stewart, the great civil rights attorney, herself imprisoned and then released because she has stage 4 cancer, Ronnie Kasriels, who founded the armed wing of the ANC with Nelson Mandela. And rebels have that quality. Rebels are not particularly good at ruling, and they're often ornery, difficult, eccentric individuals. But they have Baldwin says that it's not so much that they follow a vision. Baldwin writes this great essay on the commonality between artists and rebels, and he said it's not so much that they follow a vision as they're possessed by it. So you see in figures like Victor Serge, whose memoirs I just finished, Ronnie Kasriels himself, Che Guevara, figures who, once they get into power, are wholly unsuited for exercising power. And yet, these rebels are, Hannah Arendt says that in moments of radical evil, you turn to those, not to those who say this shouldn't be done or this oughtn't to be done, but those who say, I can't. There's just something within them that makes it impossible for them to compromise. And in this moment that we live in, we are going to have to foster and finally follow those who have this peculiar quality. I covered the Velvet Revolution in Prague. I spent every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel and Dinsbeer and Klaus and all the people who would inherit the government. And Havel I think, writes for us a very important essay, 1978, The Power of the Powerless, in which he talks about that capacity to live in truth, no matter what. And Havel's life exemplified that. So he was a non-person in Czechoslovakia from 1977, when he founded Charter 77, up until 1989. His plays were not performed, his essays weren't published, he was in and out of jail. But it is that capacity to live in truth when you face despotic power that terrifies despotic power, because those within the systems of power understand how corrupt and broken it is. And it's finally the state that determines the configurations of resistance, because the longer the state refuses to respond rationally, the more they radicalize the population that is suffering and being oppressed. So the refusal by the state to address the chronic underemployment and unemployment, the refusal by the state to institute a jobs program, to fix our infrastructure, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, the refusal of the state to institute a rational healthcare system, the refusal of the state to curb the exploitation of fossil fuels by industries which have worldwide subsidies of $5.4 billion. The prolongation of endless wars in the Middle East, which have no popular support, but which make companies like Raytheon and Halliburton and Northrop Grumman exceedingly wealthy. The tragedy for me at this particular moment in human history is the trillions of dollars we squandered in these absolutely futile and ridiculous wars which we have lost. We have lost Iraq. It's never coming back as a unified country. Afghanistan's finished. And we just watched the House pass an appropriations bill where they authorized the building of 12 new Ohio-class submarines at $8 billion apiece. As far as I know, ISIS doesn't even have a rowboat. It's not a rational response. So you see an assault. We spend about $100 billion a year on surveillance, and 70% of that surveillance is carried out by private corporations like Bose Allen Hamilton. 99% of its revenues come from the government. They feed off of the government. Anytime hedge fund managers become particularly concerned about education in the inner city, it's not because they want to teach poor black and brown people how to read and write. It's because the U.S. Department of Education spends $600 billion a year and they want it. And they're going to break the teachers' unions, turn this into vocational crap through standardized testing to get it. And that's what's happening. They are eating, consuming the very foundations that once made it possible. And they essentially, as manufacturing disintegrates or is sent to places where people are earning 22 cents an hour, these big banks and financial concerns become loan sharks, where they lend massive amounts of money so that both the empire and we can sustain a lifestyle that we can no longer afford. But it's not finally sustainable. At some point, it collapses. And at that moment, the state is ready. It has run scenario after scenario after scenario. And I think that facing this reality is exceedingly difficult. And I think it requires, in many ways, an act of faith. And I say that to people of no creeds or people of creeds. The belief that the good draws to it the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it. And then we have to let it go. Faith is the belief that the good goes somewhere, even if empirically everything around us says otherwise. And so I think all energy at this point, if we're going to save ourselves from the predicament that we have found ourselves in, requires organizing mass acts of sustained civil disobedience, that there is no other mechanism left. I was just in Boston, and Kinder Morgan and Spectrum is about to build pipelines running through Boston suburbs so tar sands from Canada can come down to the ports off of Boston and be shipped to China. And they have filed petitions and letters, and nothing's happened. And I said, that's over. The only thing left to do is buy junk cars, and when those construction machines show up, you have to drive those cars into their path, get out, take the battery out, and walk away. These are the only mechanisms we have left. And it will require risk, and it will be difficult, and it will be uncomfortable, and some of us will go to jail, and I've been in jail. There's a couple people in this room who have been in jail with me. I don't like going to jail. It's more time than I care to donate to my government. But I have children. I have 4 children. And I'm damned if I'm going to stand by and let them do this to my kids. And even if I fail, at least my kids are going to be able to say that their dad tried. I'm not naive enough to stand here and tell you we're going to win. But I know that these corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. And that is the moral imperative that confronts all of us. Who care about restoring our democracy, about giving our children and our children's children a future, about defying radical evil. And when you stand up to defy radical evil, there is a heavy price to pay. There is a cost. But if we don't pay that cost, then everything we cherish, everything we care about, everything that is important to us, and every system of life that makes love and beauty and truth and justice possible will be crushed. Thank you.